The parking lot was empty except for her. It was the kind of empty that had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the windows of a car and made the inside feel smaller than it was. Claire Whitfield sat in the back seat of her 2014 Toyota Camry, her knees pulled slightly toward her chest. A denim jacket rolled into the shape of something that was not quite a pillow, but would have to do. Under the front seat, a plastic grocery bag held three changes of clothes folded with a precision that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with necessity. She had learned in the past 2 weeks that small things done carefully were the only things she could still control. Outside, the November rain moved sideways across the parking lot of a shopping center that had been closed for years. The anchor store's sign was still up, the letters faded to the color of old bone. A security light at the far end of the lot blinked once, twice, then steadied. Claire watched it the way you watch something when you are not really watching anything at all. She was 42 years old, she was sleeping in her car, and she had not yet cried about it, which seemed to her like either a sign of strength or a sign that something inside her had quietly switched off and she could not decide which possibility was worse. Before she lay down, she checked her bag. It was a habit she had developed without meaning to, the same way you develop any habit when survival becomes the organizing principle of a day. Phone charger, the small envelope of cash she kept separate from her wallet. Her fingers moved through the bag the way they always did now, with purpose and efficiency. And then they stopped. The envelope had been there since she left the apartment 3 weeks ago. It was small, off-white, the kind of envelope you might receive a birthday card in. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she did not immediately recognize. Not printed, not typed, handwritten with the careful, slightly forward-leaning script of someone who had learned to write in an era when penmanship still mattered. She picked it up, turned it over, turned it back. She put it down. Not tonight. Whatever was inside, whatever shift it represented, she did not have the margin for it tonight. She had learned something else in the past 3 weeks, which was that the capacity to absorb new information was not infinite, and that sometimes the most rational thing a person could do was choose not to know something for a little while longer. She lay down, pulled the denim jacket over her shoulder, counted her breaths. The security light at the far end of the lot kept its vigil. The rain kept moving sideways. And somewhere in Portland, Oregon, a life that had once belonged to Claire Whitfield continued on without her, as indifferent to her absence as weather. She had been married for 11 years. That was the fact she returned to most often, not because it explained anything, but because it was the number that made the least sense when placed next to where she was now. 11 years. That was not a short marriage. That was not the kind of marriage people described as a mistake made in haste. 11 years was a whole decade and then some. It was a life built in increments, one ordinary day stacked on top of another until the stack was tall enough that you stopped being able to see the bottom of it. The house had been on a quiet street in the West Hills, one of those Portland neighborhoods where the Douglas firs grow so tall they block out the sky for months at a time, and nobody seems to mind. 2 floors, 3 bedrooms, the kind of place that took years to feel lived in, and then one day simply was. Claire had spent those years in the way she had spent most things, with attention to the small details that other people overlooked. The coffee maker set to begin brewing at 6 in the morning. The couch cushions in a particular arrangement that had evolved over time to accommodate the exact shape of a person who sat in the same spot most evenings. The shelves in the living room lined with books she had started and not finished because she liked having them around, liked the idea that they were waiting for her, that she would get to them eventually. Daniel was a structural engineer. He was tall, quiet in the specific way that reads as thoughtful until you have known someone long enough to understand that sometimes quiet is just quiet. He went to work early and came home late. He was polite at dinner and distant on weekends, and the transition between those two states had been so gradual that Claire had not noticed the moment it became the permanent arrangement rather than a temporary one. She had told herself, in the way that people tell themselves things they have not fully examined, that this was what long marriages looked like. that the urgency of early love was supposed to fade, that what replaced it was something quieter and more durable, that the absence of friction was not the same as the absence of feeling. She had told herself these things and she had believed them, or she had believed them enough, which in the end amounts to the same thing. The kitchen was where it happened. A Tuesday evening in March, the overhead light casting its slightly yellow pallor over everything, the way it always did a pot of water on the stove that had not yet reached a boil. Daniel was standing near the counter, still in his work clothes, and there was nothing in his posture that indicated what was coming. No tension in his shoulders, no avoidance in his eyes. He looked, if anything, slightly tired, the way he always looked at the end of a long week. He said, "I don't think I want this anymore." Claire waited for the rest of it, for the explanation, the context, the litany of grievances that would at least give her something to hold, something to argue against or agree with or push back on. She waited because surely there was more. Surely 11 years warranted more than a single sentence delivered in the tone one uses to mention that the grocery store was out of something. There was no more. He had meant exactly what he said with exactly the weight he had given it, and nothing she asked in the weeks that followed produced anything additional. No betrayal to name, no single moment to point at, just a slow, private drift that he had apparently completed navigating long before she realized they were adrift at all. The legal process that came after was the part she had not been prepared for, which was its own kind of education. She hired a lawyer based on a recommendation from a colleague, a man named Gary Melton, who had an office in Northwest Portland and a wall full of diplomas, in the kind of reassuring manner that turned out to be a substitute for thoroughness rather than an expression of it. Gary told her at their first meeting and at several subsequent meetings that she had nothing to worry about. He told her this while failing to read carefully the documents that would have told him otherwise. The house in West Hills had been purchased by Daniel before they married. This fact, which Gary might have caught if he had been paying closer attention, meant that under Oregon law, the property was considered separate rather than marital. The savings accounts, which Claire had understood to be jointly held, had been structured in a way she had never scrutinized, with Claire listed as an authorized user on accounts that were legally Daniel's. Even the nature of her income, freelance and variable, and paid to her personally rather than to any kind of shared enterprise, meant that she had less ground to stand on than she had assumed. By the time the final paperwork was signed, Claire understood that she had spent 11 years building a life in a house that was not hers, with money that was not equally theirs, in the care of a lawyer who had not done his job. She went to Gary's office one last time. He sat across from her with the posture of a man who had decided in advance that he would absorb whatever came without appearing ruffled. He expressed regret. He used the word "unfortunately" 3 times. He slid a final invoice across the desk. Claire looked at the invoice for a long moment, then she slid it back. She stood up. She did not raise her voice because she found in that moment that she did not need to. She walked out of the office and did not look back, and it was only later, sitting in the Camry in the parking garage, that she recognized what she had felt in that room. Not anger exactly, something colder and more useful. A line had been crossed, and she had seen it crossed, and she had filed it away in the part of herself that was going to need to be harder from here on. She had called Rebecca that evening. Her sister was 38 and lived in Salem with her husband, Tom, and their 2 children, a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, who were at the age of perpetual motion and maximum noise. Claire had not spoken to Rebecca about the full extent of what was happening because there was something in the telling that made it more real, and she had been rationing the reality of it in the same way she was rationing everything else. But that night she told her. The house, the accounts, Gary Melton and his invoice, the apartment she could no longer afford, the math that did not add up, no matter how many ways she ran it. Rebecca's voice on the phone had the texture of someone trying to figure out the right thing to say while simultaneously consulting a second internal conversation happening alongside the real one. There were pauses. There were soft expressions of sympathy that sounded like they were buying time. And then gently, with the care of someone delivering news they know will land badly, "Tom thinks maybe just a few weeks would be too much right now." Claire heard the words. She heard what they meant and what they did not say, and what the shape of them revealed about the conversation that had happened in that house in Salem before this phone call was made. She said, okay. She hung up before Rebecca could add anything else. Not because she was angry, though she was, but because she knew with a clarity that surprised her that if she stayed on the line another 30 seconds, she would start to ask. And she could not ask. That was the one thing she could not do. She had lost the house and the money and 11 years in the specific future she had imagined for herself, and she was not going to lose the last thing she still fully owned, which was the dignity of not begging. The apartment lease ended on a Saturday. She left the key on the kitchen counter and carried her bags to the Camry and drove until she found a Walmart that was still lit up at 10 o'clock at night with a parking lot large enough that a single car sitting in the far corner would not draw attention. She told herself it was temporary, that it would be a few weeks, that she would figure something out. She was in that parking lot 2 weeks later when she first noticed the man. He was older, maybe in his mid-60s, with the deliberate movements of someone whose body had been used hard over many years and had come to a kind of understanding about what it would and would not do anymore. He wore a security uniform and carried a flashlight that he mostly pointed at the ground. He did not look like a man who was looking for trouble. He looked like a man who had already found all the trouble he needed in life and was now simply working a night shift. His name, she would learn eventually, was Marcus Webb. He had been working the overnight security shift at this Walmart for 4 years after a period he would describe only as a harder stretch, which she understood without asking to mean something more than a rough patch. He was the kind of man who understood things without being told them, which is to say he was a man who had needed people to understand things about him without being told, and had learned by necessity to extend the same courtesy. The first time he knocked on her window, Claire's stomach dropped to the floor of the car. She had known this moment was coming, had been dreading it since the first night, the moment when someone in a uniform would tap on the glass and tell her she needed to move along. She had been rehearsing her response, which was to be calm and cooperative, and to have already started the engine before they finished their sentence. But Marcus did not tell her to move. He held up a hand palm out in the way that means "I come in peace," which is a gesture that only works because everyone agrees it does. He said, "I'm not here about the car." Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and set a brown paper bag on the hood gently and walked away. She sat with that for a long time before she opened the bag. Inside was a turkey sandwich and a small bag of chips and a bottle of water. Nothing fancy, nothing that required explanation. The following Friday, there was another bag. The Friday after that, she opened her door before he could walk away. He stopped, turned around. She said, "You don't have to do this." He said, "I know. I did the same thing in 2009. Fresno, different lot, same smell." He said it without weight or performance, the way you state a fact that has been facts for long enough to no longer require commentary. She looked at him and he looked at her, and something passed between them that did not need to be named. It was 3 weeks after that conversation on a night when she could not sleep and had been staring at the ceiling of the car for what felt like most of the night that Claire made the mistake of searching Daniel's name on her phone. She was sitting in the library the next morning, charging her phone at one of the public outlets near the reference section when she found it, a LinkedIn post. Dated 9 months ago, which meant it had been published 9 months before their divorce was finalized, which meant it had been published while they were still living in the same house, having polite dinners and distant weekends, performing the version of a marriage that had apparently already been decommissioned. The post announced a promotion. It used phrases like "new chapter" and "exciting opportunities" and "next phase." It had 47 likes and a comment section full of congratulations from colleagues and professional acquaintances who had all apparently known that Daniel Whitfield was beginning something new at a time when Claire Whitfield had believed he was simply going through a quiet period. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table. The librarian at the reference desk, a young woman with reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead, looked over and asked if she was all right. Claire said yes. She was not all right. But she was beginning to understand something that she had not understood before, which was that the ending of her marriage had not been a sudden thing, had not been a decision made in a kitchen on a Tuesday evening in March. It had been a long, deliberate process of disengagement, and the kitchen had been the final formality. Everything she had told herself about long marriages and quiet love and the natural fading of urgency had been something she had built to explain an absence she had felt but refused to name. She sat in the library for 40 minutes without moving, while around her people returned books and asked questions and went on with the ordinary business of a day. Then she picked up her phone, put it in her bag, and went outside. She needed a job. It took her another week to find one she could hold on to. She had done freelance interior design work throughout the marriage building, a client list slowly the way you build anything when you are doing it alongside other things. But freelance work requires a phone number that gets answered promptly, an email address that gets checked, a mental bandwidth that is difficult to maintain when your primary preoccupation is finding a safe place to park before 10 o'clock at night. The Copper Kettle was a small cafe in the Selwood neighborhood, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and a particular smell of coffee that had soaked into the walls over years. Sandra Okafor had been running it alone for 7 years. She was 51, originally from Lagos, and she had the bearing of a woman who had made a large number of decisions under pressure and had gotten most of them right. She interviewed Claire at a corner table on a slow Tuesday morning with a directness that felt almost like relief after weeks of ambiguity. The interview was brief. Sandra asked two questions. The first was whether Claire had experience with cafe work. Claire said she did not. Sandra moved on to the second question without commenting on the first. The second question was whether Claire could show up on time every single day. Claire said yes. Sandra looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone who is trying to read something that is being deliberately kept from the surface. Then she said, "Start tomorrow." She did not ask about the car. She did not ask about the apartment. She either did not notice or did not require the information in order to make her decision, and Claire was grateful for both possibilities equally. It was Marcus Webb who almost undid the whole thing. 2 weeks into the job at Copper Kettle, he found her outside the cafe one morning, before her shift, sitting in the car with the engine off, and he knocked on the passenger window with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything. She rolled it down. He had heard through a channel he did not fully explain that the cafe was a good place. He said there was a cashier position open at the Walmart. No lapse in coverage, her situation would not be discussed. She said no before he finished the sentence. He did not push. He simply said, "Pride is a warm feeling, Claire, but it doesn't run your heat." Then he walked away the way he always did without waiting for a response, which was either very wise or very deliberate or both. She thought about what he said for 2 days. On the third day, she walked into the Walmart, not through Marcus and not through any connection he had offered, but directly on her own and asked to speak with whoever handled hiring. She filled out the application at a table near the customer service desk. She did not tell Marcus that she had done this. When she saw him a week later working the floor in a different section, he simply nodded at her from across the aisle. She nodded back. That was the whole of it. And somehow it was enough. It was a Thursday night 6 weeks into the Camry that she drove through the West Hills without meaning to. She had been heading back to the Walmart lot from a late shift and had taken a wrong turn somewhere, or had made a turn that was not wrong in the sense of being accidental, because the route to the West Hills was a route she had driven hundreds of times and her hands knew it without being asked. She recognized what she was doing only when she was already on the familiar street, already slowing down in the way you slow when you are approaching something you are not sure you want to see. She stopped 2 houses down on the opposite side of the street, turned off her lights. The house looked the same. That was the thing she had not prepared for. She had somehow expected that her absence would have left a visible mark, some external evidence of the interior catastrophe. But the house sat there in the dark, with its lights on, warm and unchanged, and completely indifferent. and the only difference she could identify from this distance was the shadow moving behind the curtain in the upstairs window. It was not Daniel's shadow. The shape was different, smaller. The way a person moves through a room tells you things about them, and this person moved through that room with the ease of someone who had been moving through it for a while. Claire sat with that information for as long as she could stand to. Then she started the car and drove away and did not look in the rearview mirror because she was beginning to understand that the direction she needed to look was not behind her. She was in the back seat of the Camry 1 week later when the worst night came. Marcus had warned her. He had told her 3 days before that the overnight security at the Walmart lot was being tightened a regional policy change and that her usual spot would not be safe for at least a week. She thanked him and told him she would find somewhere else, which she believed when she said it. The lot she chose was on the east side of the city behind a grocery store that had closed 2 years ago. It looked adequate from the street. It looked like a place where a car could sit overnight without drawing attention. What she had not accounted for was that adequate is not the same as safe, and that a lot that looks empty is not always empty. She had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when the other car pulled in. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of tires on cracked asphalt, and she sat up the way she had learned to sit up quickly and completely without the groggy transition period that sleep normally requires. The car parked close, too close, the kind of close that is a choice rather than an accident. Two men got out. One of them knocked on her window with his knuckles not gently. He said something she could hear through the glass, the words muffled, but the tone clear. It was the tone of someone who had decided in advance how this interaction was going to go. Claire did not roll down the window. She put the key in the ignition. She turned it. She put the car in reverse, and she moved carefully and then quickly navigating around the other vehicle in the dark with her hands steady in the way that hands can be steady when the body has decided that steadiness is what the moment requires. She did not look at the men again. She kept her eyes on the path out, and she took it. When she reached a lit street 2 blocks away, she pulled over under a streetlight and sat for a moment. Her hands were on the wheel and her breathing was doing something she needed to correct. She corrected it. She looked in the rear view mirror and noticed for the first time that the passenger side mirror was gone. Not cracked. Gone. Taken off clean, which meant they had been closer to the car than she had realized as she pulled out close enough to catch the mirror on their bumper. She sat under that streetlight until the sky began to show its first gray at the edges. She did not sleep again. She ran through the math of the situation the same way she ran through all the math now methodically and without the luxury of panic, because panic was something she could not afford and had quietly stopped allowing. When it was fully light, she drove to the Copper Kettle. She was 20 minutes early for her shift. Sandra was already there, had been there for an hour the way she was every morning. She looked at Claire when she came through the back door. She looked at the passenger side mirror or the space where it had been. She did not ask what happened. She poured a cup of coffee and set it on the counter without saying anything. Claire sat down on the stool near the espresso machine and wrapped her hands around the cup. The coffee was too hot to drink yet. She held it anyway. Outside, Portland was starting its day in the way cities do, with a slow accumulation of noise and motion and the particular light of a November morning that has not yet decided whether it intends to be gray or something better. Inside the Copper Kettle, the smell of coffee in the walls was the same smell it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow, and that consistency was its own kind of comfort, small and ordinary, and exactly sufficient. Claire sat with the cup until she could drink it. Then she drank it. Then she stood up and started her shift, because that was what you did, and because the alternative was something she had already decided was not available to her. In her bag under the counter, the envelope waited. It had been waiting for 3 weeks now. It would wait a little longer. She was not ready yet. But she was closer than she had been, and she knew it the way you know a thing that you are not quite willing to say out loud. She was closer than she had been. She found it on a Thursday night in the pocket of a jacket she had not worn in 3 weeks. She was not looking for it. She was looking for the chapstick she kept in the left pocket, the one she had been meaning to replace since October. And instead, her fingers closed around the envelope and the chapstick stopped mattering entirely. She was sitting on a cot in the back room of the copper kettle under a single bare bulb that Sandra had replaced with a warmer one without mentioning it, which was the way Sandra did most things. The room was narrow, just wide enough for the cot and a shelf and a folding chair, and it smelled of coffee and cardboard and the particular industrial cleaner that Sandra used on the floors every Sunday. It was not much, but it had a door that locked from the inside, and in the hierarchy of things that mattered to Claire, now that fact sat very near the top. She had not wanted to take the room. She wanted that on the record, at least in her own mind, that she had not taken it easily. Sandra had discovered the truth on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks into the job, when she came through the back door earlier than usual and found Claire in the bathroom changing into her work clothes with the quick efficiency of someone who has learned to complete that task before the world is fully awake. Sandra stood in the doorway for a moment and then went to start the espresso machine without saying anything. But the next morning she brought it up. She sat down across from Claire at the corner table before the cafe opened and said without preamble, "There is a cot in the back room. It is not comfortable, but it is indoors, and you are going to use it." Claire said she was fine. Sandra said, "I didn't ask if you were fine." Claire said she didn't need charity. Sandra looked at her with an expression that was not sympathy and was not pity and was not the careful diplomatic patience that people sometimes deploy when they are trying not to offend. It was something closer to impatience, the impatience of someone who has very little tolerance for watching a person make things harder for themselves than they need to be. She said, "You think suffering quietly makes you stronger. It just makes you quieter." Claire stood up from the table and went to start her shift. She did not speak to Sandra directly for 2 days after that. They worked around each other in the small space of the cafe with the careful choreography of two people who have decided to give the other room. Sandra did not bring it up again. She did not soften the offer or repackage it or present it differently. She simply, on the morning of the third day, set a key on the counter near the espresso machine and walked away. Claire looked at the key for a long time. Then she picked it up and put it in her pocket and said nothing because Sandra had not waited for a response and did not appear to require one. That had been 4 days ago. Now Claire sat on the cot with the envelope in her hand, and the bare bulb above her threw its warm light over the off-white paper, and she read her own name on the front of it in handwriting she had been trying to place for 3 weeks. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded into quarters, and something else, something small and hard that fell into her palm when she unfolded the paper, a key. Old. The kind of key that belongs to a manual lock, the kind that houses had before the world moved to deadbolts and keypads. It had a small rectangular tag attached to it with a piece of string, and on the tag, in the same careful handwriting as the envelope, was an address. Bend, Oregon. Below the address, 2 lines of text, "When you're ready." It's been waiting, no signature, no return address, no explanation of what it was or how long it had been waiting or what the writer expected Claire to do with this information. She read the 2 lines 3 more times. Then she turned the sheet over, looking for something on the back, and found nothing. She held the key in her palm and looked at it. It was lighter than she expected. The brass had darkened with age in the way that brass does, taking on a color somewhere between gold and brown, and the teeth of it were worn in a way that suggested it had been used many times over many years before being saved for this. And then something shifted in her, a recognition that arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation somewhere in the region of her sternum. She knew this handwriting. She had not recognized it immediately because she had not seen it in years, and because the context was so far outside anything she would have predicted that her brain had declined to make the connection. But now, sitting in the narrow back room of the copper kettle with the key in her palm and the paper in her other hand, she saw it. The slightly forward lean, The way the letters in her name were formed, particularly the C, which had a particular loop at the top that she had watched being made at kitchen tables and on birthday cards and on the backs of photographs. This was her grandmother's handwriting. Eleanor Marsh had been dead for 3 years. Claire sat with that for a long moment, doing the arithmetic of it, which did not add up in any direction she tried. Eleanor had died in the spring of 2019. This envelope had been placed under the door of her apartment in November of 2022. The math between those two dates was not math that worked, and yet here was the handwriting, and here was the key, and here was the address in a city where Claire had no connections and no history. Someone had kept this. Someone had held on to it for 3 years and then delivered it at a moment they had judged to be the right one. She did not know who. She did not know how they had known where she was living or how they had known the moment had come. She was still thinking about this when she fell asleep, which she did without meaning to, with the key still in her hand and the paper unfolded on the cot beside her. She found Marcus on a Tuesday, his last week on the overnight shift, before a schedule change moved him to days. She had been waiting for the right moment to ask and had decided there was no right moment and simply had to ask. She showed him the envelope, not the key, not the address, just the envelope with her name on the front, the handwriting visible. He looked at it for longer than she expected. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but had elements of both. He said, "My wife knew your grandmother." His wife's name was Doris. She had died in 2021 after a long illness that Marcus referenced only in the way that people reference things that have cost them everything, with a brevity that has nothing to do with the size of what is being described. Doris and Eleanor Marsh had met through a local volunteer organization, the kind of community work that gets done quietly by people who do not require credit for doing it, and they had been close for nearly a decade. Before Eleanor died, she had given the envelope to Doris. She had asked Doris to hold on to it. She had said, "Give it to Claire when she needs it most. She'll know when that is." Doris had held on to it for 2 years through her own illness, keeping it somewhere safe. And when she died, Marcus had found it with a note of his own from Doris, telling him what it was and what to do with it. He had been watching for Claire in the particular way that a man watches for someone when he has been told to watch, but has not been told when they will appear. When he recognized her, when he understood from the specifics of her situation that the moment had arrived, he had put the envelope under her door. Claire listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she asked, "Did you know what was inside?" He said no. Doris didn't either, I think. Just that it needed to get to you. He reached into his jacket then and produced a piece of paper folded once, which he held out to her. She took it. On it was a name and a phone number and an address in Bend, Oregon. A lawyer named Howard Gale. Marcus said your grandmother trusted him. My wife did too. I don't know more than that. He put his hand out. She shook it the way you shake a hand when what you are actually doing is something that does not have a gesture assigned to it. He walked back toward the store entrance without looking back, and she stood in the parking lot with the piece of paper and the key and the address and a phone call she needed to make before she could do anything else. She made the call that afternoon from the corner table at the Copper Kettle during the slow hour between the lunch rush and the afternoon crowd. She dialed Daniel's number, which she had not deleted because deleting it had felt like a decision she was not ready to formalize, and he answered on the third ring. His voice was the voice she knew, the flat, even tenor of a man who had trained himself out of vocal expressiveness so thoroughly that it had become his natural register. He said her name as a question. She did not do preamble. She told him she had an address in Bend. She read it to him. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences, which were the silences of someone who was taking his time pacing himself. This one had a texture she had not heard before. This one was the silence of a person who has just heard something they were not prepared to hear and is doing rapid internal calculations about what to say next. Then he said, "Don't go there, Claire. It's not what you think." She said, "What do I think? Daniel's nothing." She could hear him breathing. The breathing was not even. He said, "Just don't." She said, "That's not an answer." The line was quiet long enough that she thought he had hung up. Then she heard him one more time, and what she heard was not coldness and was not the careful distance he had maintained through all of it. What she heard was something that sounded underneath all the control, very much like fear. Then the line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the table in front of her. In the years she had known Daniel, she had heard him be many things: distant, polite, deliberate, occasionally warm in the specific way that a man is warm when he has decided to be. She had never heard him afraid. The fear changed the geometry of the situation in a way she could not fully articulate, but could feel the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Whatever was at that address, he did not want her to find it. And the fact that he did not want her to find it was the clearest possible reason to go. Sandra gave her $300 in cash when she told her she was leaving. She handed it over in the way she did everything without theater, without conditions. She said gas and food. Not for pride. This time Claire did not argue. She left Portland on a Friday morning in December, the Cascades white-capped against a sky that had not decided what it was doing yet. The radio in the Camry had been unreliable for weeks, and she left it alone, driving the 3 hours to Bend in the quiet of her own thoughts, which were not comfortable company, but were honest ones. She had not told anyone where she was going except Sandra. She had not told Rebecca, partly because they had not spoken since the phone call, and partly because she was not sure she had the words for what she was doing. She was driving toward an address that her dead grandmother had written down on a piece of paper. It had traveled through 2 other people's hands before reaching hers. She was doing this because a man who had barely spoken to her in months had told her not to, with fear in his voice. She was doing this because the alternative was going back to the parking lot, and she had been in the parking lot long enough. The address took her off the highway 12 miles outside of Bend onto a 2-lane road that narrowed gradually until it was something closer to a path. The Douglas firs closed in on both sides, green and silent, and the afternoon light came through them in long, slanted pieces that moved across the hood of the car as she drove. She almost missed it. The turnoff was unmarked, just a break in the trees where a dirt road began, and she saw it only because she was going slowly, watching for it the way you watch for things when you are not sure what you are looking for. She turned in. The road was perhaps a quarter-mile long, winding slightly, the trees giving way as she drove, until the property opened up and she could see the whole of it at once. It was smaller than she had imagined, though she realized she had not consciously been imagining anything. A tiny house, 400 square feet at most, with board and batten siding, weathered to a soft gray, and a porch that faced west into what would be, in another hour, a considerable sunset. The windows were larger than you would expect for a house this size, which gave the whole structure the quality of something that was paying attention to the world around it. Behind the house, the land continued, more than the building suggested, sloping gently toward a tree line at the back of the property. There were no other cars, no lights on inside, no evidence that anyone had been here recently or that anyone was expected. Claire sat in the Camry for a moment with the engine running. Then she turned it off. She walked to the door. The key was in her hand, and she was not allowing herself to think about what happened if it did not fit, because she had been not allowing herself to think about that for the entire 3-hour drive, and she was going to continue the policy for the next 30 seconds. She put the key in the lock. It fit the way a key fits a lock that was made for it specifically, with a small resistance that gave way cleanly and a single soft click that seemed out of proportion to its volume. She pushed the door open. The light inside was the light of late afternoon coming through west-facing windows, warm and without urgency, and it fell across a small kitchen, a narrow staircase leading to a loft, and a table positioned precisely to catch the sun at this hour of this day. The table was handmade. She could see that immediately, the particular character of something built by a person, rather than manufactured, the slight irregularities in the joinery that were not flaws but signatures. She did not move for a long moment. The space held itself quietly around her, the way a room does when it has been empty long enough to settle into its own temperature and smell. And the smell was wood and something faintly mineral. the smell of clean air that has been sitting still. On the table at its center was a piece of paper folded in half. She crossed the room and picked it up. The paper was older than the envelope. The edges had been handled enough times to go slightly soft, and the fold had the permanence of something that had been opened and refolded many times before being left here in its final position. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Eleanor's, for when you're ready to start over. Not the life you planned, the one you choose. Claire read it once, then again. Then she stood holding it in both hands while the afternoon light moved almost imperceptibly across the floor, and something happened in her chest that was not relief and was not grief and was not the specific sensation of a wound closing. It was something older and quieter than any of those things. It was the feeling of a door opening in a room she had forgotten existed. She did not cry. She did not sit down. She stood at the table where the note had been waiting, and she read it a third time, and this time she felt it arrive in a different place, not in her mind, but somewhere lower and more fundamental. She was not ready to understand everything it meant, but she was ready to stay. She did not unpack her bag that night. She set it near the door, close enough to the exit that she could not pretend it was anything other than what it was, the bag of a person who had not yet committed to remaining. She had been doing this, she realized, since the day she left the apartment. Placing her belongings near exits, keeping her options organized and portable, refusing to let anything settle too deeply into any place in case that place turned out to be temporary. She climbed the stairs to the loft. The ceiling was low, the kind of low that forces intimacy with the space above you. She lay down and looked up at it in the last of the light, and then the light was gone, and she was in the dark, and the dark in this place was different from any dark she had been in for the past 6 weeks. No ambient glow from a parking lot, no distant traffic, just the dark as it existed before cities decided to compete with it. She could not sleep. She was too aware of the silence, of the specific quality of stillness in this room, the fact that she did not need to listen for anything. And it was in that state, suspended between exhaustion and alertness, that she noticed it. Above her at the apex of the ceiling, where the boards met, something had been carved into the wood. Small, deliberate. 3 letters. EMC Eleanor Marsh Cooper, her grandmother's initials from before the marriage that changed her name from the version of herself that had existed before anyone else had claimed to her. Claire lay in the dark and looked at those 3 letters and felt the distance between them and her close to almost nothing. In the morning, she found Howard Gale. His office was on a quiet street in Ben's downtown, the kind of office that has been in the same location for decades and has the quality of a place that intends to remain. He was 67, white-haired, with the economical manner of a man who has spent many years being paid for precision and has come to value it in all areas of his life. He had known Eleanor Marsh, he said, for a long time. He had been expecting Claire, he said, though not necessarily now, not necessarily this week. He had been expecting her the way you expect something you have been told will eventually arrive. He set a document on the desk between them. It was a living trust, Eleanor's name at the top, dated 3 years before her death. And within it, clearly and without ambiguity, the transfer of a piece of property in Bend, Oregon, including all structures on it, into the name of Claire Ann Whitfield. Claire looked at her own name on the page. She said, "Did Daniel know about this?" Howard paused in the way that a careful man pauses when he is selecting words from a larger set and discarding several before choosing. He said he made inquiries. I declined to act on them. She said, "What kind of inquiries?" He said, "The kind that would have required me to act against your interests." She asked the question she needed to ask. She asked it quietly without the anger she had expected to feel because the anger had not arrived yet, and she suspected it was traveling toward her from some distance. She asked, "Is this really mine?" No question. Howard looked at her across the desk with the directness of a man who does not traffic in comfort when what is needed is truth. He said, "It has been for 3 years." She left his office and walked to the Camry and sat in it in the small parking lot behind his building. She did not start the engine. The December light was thin and cold, and it came through the windshield and lay across her hands on the steering wheel. 3 years. She had lived in the apartment for 2 of those years, paying rent with money she was never going to have enough of, worrying about the freelance pipeline, watching the savings she had not known were not equally hers diminish in ways she did not understand. She had sat in the Walmart parking lot for 6 weeks learning which security guards would leave her alone and which would not, eating turkey sandwiches from a paper bag and setting an alarm for 5:45 in the morning so she could disappear before the world was watching. All of it, every single day of it. And this had been here. The anger arrived. It was not the cold, functional anger she had felt in Gary Melton's office, the kind she had used to walk out of a room. This was the other kind, the kind that has been held below the surface long enough to have developed pressure, the kind that does not have a specific target because it is too large for any one target to contain. It moved through her in a wave, and she did not try to stop it because she understood instinctively that stopping it was no longer an option. She cried in the parking lot behind Howard Gale's office for approximately 15 minutes. Not prettily, not in the cinematic way that grief arranges itself in the imagination. In the real way, which is ungainly and physical and does not care about being witnessed. And then it stopped. As abruptly as it had come, it was over, and she sat in the silence that followed it and felt underneath the wreckage of the past quarter hour something she had not expected to find there. Space, not peace, not resolution, just room. As if the anger had been taking up square footage she did not know she had, and now that it had moved through her and out, the interior landscape was larger than it had been. She wiped her face. She started the car. She drove back to the house on the dirt road parked in the place she was already beginning to think of as her spot, and walked the perimeter of the property the way she had been meaning to do since the previous afternoon. The land was more substantial than it had appeared from the driveway. Behind the house, it opened up, the slight downward slope she had noticed from inside becoming more pronounced, leveling out at the back near a stand of ponderosa pines that marked the property line. She walked slowly, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, her boots finding the uneven ground without difficulty. She was near the north foundation wall, where the ground met the house's base in a border of loose rock and packed earth, when she noticed it. A section of ground that looked different. It was subtle, the kind of thing you would not notice if you were not paying attention, but she was paying attention in the way that people who have lost everything start paying attention to their surroundings with a thoroughness that ordinary comfort never requires. The soil here was darker, slightly more yielding the texture of earth that has been disturbed and resettled rather than left alone. She crouched down. She pressed her hand against the surface and felt the difference. She began to move the soil aside with her fingers carefully at first, and then with more purpose, and 8 inches down her fingers found metal. The corner of a box. It was a tin, old style, the kind that used to hold everything from cookies to gouache to the documents that mattered most and needed to be kept somewhere water and time could not reach. She pulled it free from the soil and turned it over in her hands. The exterior was mottled with age but intact, and the lid, when she tried it, lifted without resistance. Inside, wrapped in a sealed plastic bag to protect against moisture, was a collection of papers and photographs. And on top of everything else, folded carefully and placed where she would find it first, was a letter. She looked at the handwriting, Eleanor's. She stood there in the cold with the tin in her hands and the letter on top and the north wall of her house at her back, and she understood that whatever questions she had arrived with, she was about to get answers she had not known to ask for. The letter was 4 pages long. Eleanor Marsh had written it by hand on the same lined paper she had used for everything that mattered, at pressing hard enough with the pen that you could feel the words from the back of the page if you ran your finger across it. Claire read it standing in the cold with a tin box under her arm and the north wall of the house behind her, and she read it the way you read something when you understand that what you are holding is the last conversation you will ever have with a person who is no longer alive to finish it. Eleanor had bought the land in 1987. She had done it with a woman named Margaret Whitfield, who was Daniel's mother, at a time when the two of them had been adjacent neighbors in a Portland suburb and had arrived at one of those friendships that form between women of a certain practicality, built less on shared interests than on mutual recognition of how the world actually operates. They had pooled what they had and purchased the acreage outside Bend as an investment, vague in its purpose, specific in its intention to be something that belonged to them and not to the circumstances around them. In 1994, Margaret Whitfield signed her portion over to Eleanor entirely. The letter did not explain why, only that it had been done cleanly and without dispute, and that from that point, the land was Eleanor's alone. The house had come later, built incrementally over several summers, with the help of Margaret's son Walter, who was not Daniel, but Daniel's uncle, a carpenter by trade and by temperament, who had driven down from Portland on long weekends to frame walls and set windows and build the furniture that the interior required. Claire stopped. She read that section again. Walter Marsh, Eleanor's husband, who had died in 1995. Walter, who had put his hands on the wood of the table she had touched when she walked in the door, who had climbed the stairs to the loft and looked at the ceiling and decided to leave something there. 3 small letters pressed into the wood with a tool she would never know the name of. She had never met Walter Marsh. He had died when she was 15, before she was old enough to be brought to family gatherings that involved the older generation, and Eleanor had spoken of him the way that people speak of the dead, when the grief has mellowed into something that can be lived alongside with affection in a kind of matter-of-fact acknowledgement that some absences never fully close. She looked at the table through the window of the house. From this angle in the December light, she could see the grain of the wood clearly, the particular way it moved in the boards, the irregularities in the surface that were not imperfections, but records of the hands that had shaped it. She went inside and finished reading the letter at the table Walter had made. Eleanor wrote that she had watched Claire's marriage from the distance that grandmothers are permitted and had understood earlier than she would have wished that it was not going to hold. She did not elaborate on what she had seen or when she had seen it. She did not need to. She had simply seen it the way that certain people see things, with a combination of experience and attention that passes for wisdom when it is accurate. She had not intervened. She had made a deliberate choice not to. She wrote, "I thought about telling you. I thought about it more times than you would believe. But I knew that if you had a place to go, you would think of it as a place to go to and not as a place to begin from. Those are not the same thing. I needed you to arrive here with nothing left to hold on to so that you would understand what this is. It is not a landing. It is a starting line." Claire set the letter down on the table. She had expected reading it to feel the particular bitterness of someone who has been managed, whose choices have been anticipated and arranged around by someone else who believed they knew better. She waited for that feeling. It did not come. What came instead was something more complicated, the recognition that Eleanor had been right, and that being right about something like this requires a kind of love that most people are not patient enough to sustain. If she had known about this place 2 years ago, she would have come here after a bad week and called it a recovery. She would have sat on this porch and felt better and driven back to Portland in the apartment in the slow dissolution of a marriage she was not ready to name as lost. She would have used this place the way people use every comfort available to them to make the unbearable bearable enough to continue. She would not have built anything here. She would have borrowed it. Eleanor had known that. And she had waited, and she had trusted Doris Webb to know when the waiting was over. And Doris had trusted Marcus, and Marcus had put an envelope under a door. And here was Claire at a handmade table in a house that was hers, reading the last letter her grandmother would ever send her. She folded the pages carefully and put them back in the tin, and she put the tin on the shelf above the cot in the narrow back room, where she was not going to sleep anymore because she was going to sleep in the loft. And then she went outside and stood on the porch and looked west at what remained of the afternoon. She unpacked her bag that evening. It took less time than it should have because there was less than there should have been. She had been traveling light for months, and the inventory of what she owned fit into a suitcase and two tote bags with room to spare. She put things in drawers and on shelves and hung two jackets on the hooks near the door. And when she was finished, she stood in the middle of the small space and looked at it. It looked like someone lived there. She went to bed in the loft and she slept the night through for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. She found a job at a cafe called the Owl Roost, 12 minutes from the house by the route that went around the long bend in the road rather than through it, a route she chose because the trees were better. The manager hired her in a conversation that lasted 8 minutes, which was 4 minutes shorter than Sandra's interview, and covered less interesting ground. She started the following Monday and discovered during the paperwork portion of her first day that she was required to provide a permanent address. She wrote the address of the house on the line. She had filled out that kind of form many times in her life and had never paused at that particular field before because there had always been an address, always been a place the mail could find her that was also without drama, the place she came home to. Now she wrote the address and stopped for a moment and looked at it on the page, and the ordinary fact of it, the fact that this was simply true, that there was a door she could unlock in a loft she would sleep in, and a table at a west-facing window that had been built for her by a man she had never met, required a moment to settle. She capped the pen and finished the form. Winter moved through Bend with the particular thoroughness of high desert winters, which are colder than they look from the outside and longer than the calendar suggests. Claire learned the rhythms of the house, the way the heat distributed itself through the small rooms, the corner of the loft that stayed warmest, the window in the kitchen that let in the most morning light, and the particular angle at which the sun came through it in late December. Horizontal and specific landing on the edge of the handmade table like a plumb line. She planted herbs on the kitchen windowsill. Basil first, then rosemary, then thyme because the thyme seemed the hardest to keep alive, and she wanted to know if she could. She cooked in the evenings after her shifts at the Owl Roost. Simple things at first, and then more deliberate ones, working through the small collection of spices she had bought at a grocery store in Bend, and building a kind of fluency with the kitchen that she had not had since the early years of the marriage, when cooking had still felt like something she was doing rather than something that needed to be done. Patrice Holland arrived on a Wednesday in January. She knocked at 4 in the afternoon when the light was already going thin, and Claire was home from an early shift, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had not finished and a book she had been trying to read since October. The knock was tentative but deliberate, the knock of someone who has been standing outside working up to it. Claire opened the door. The woman on the porch was 39, with travel clothes that had been slept in at least once, and an expression that was trying to be composed and not entirely succeeding. She said she was sorry to bother anyone. She had an address from an online listing that appeared to no longer be accurate. She was looking for a place to stay for one night she could pay. Claire looked at her. She looked at the car in the driveway, a Subaru with two duffel bags visible through the rear window. She looked at the woman's face, which was doing the work of presenting normalcy while something considerably less normal was operating just underneath it. Claire recognized the architecture of that effort. She said one night, she moved back from the door. Patrice was it emerged over that evening and the days that followed, a fourth-grade teacher from Eugene who had walked out of her school building on a Thursday afternoon and driven east without a specific destination, and then called in sick for the following day and the day after that. She was not in crisis in the acute sense. She was in the slower, more insidious crisis of a person who has given everything available to her to a life that has slowly stopped giving anything back, and who has arrived at a point where continuing requires a resource she can no longer locate in herself. She was not Claire's responsibility. Claire knew this. She also knew what it looked like to be a person who needed not rescue, not advice, not a plan, but simply a place to stop moving for a moment and breathe. One night became three became a week. On the 8th day, Patrice began talking about the house. She said it over breakfast with the casual energy of someone who has been thinking about something for several days and has decided to try it out loud. This place has real potential. With the right approach, you could have guests here year-round, a proper listing, some updates to the exterior. She had done some research, she said, on short-term rental rates in the Bend area. The numbers were actually very good. Claire listened. She let Patrice finish. She set her cup down. Then she said, Patrice. The other woman looked at her. Claire said, this is not a project. This is my home. You are welcome here as a guest, but I need you to understand the difference between those two things. It landed the way she had intended it to, which was not unkindly, but without cushioning. Patrice was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, you're right. I'm sorry. I do that. I start optimizing things because it's easier than sitting with them. Claire said, I know. The apology was genuine, and the recognition that followed it was genuine, and the conversation they had that evening, which was long and specific in covered ground, that neither of them had covered with anyone recently, was one of the better conversations Claire had in that house. By the end of the second week, Patrice asked if she could help repaint the porch, not as a renovation, not as an improvement to property value, but because she needed something physical to do with her hands, and the porch needed paint, and she was good at it. Claire said yes. They painted the porch on a Saturday, 2 coats of soft gray white that dried darker than the sample and turned out to be exactly right. They did not talk much while they worked. The work was sufficient company. When Patrice finally left on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after she had arrived, she stood by her car for a moment and looked at the house with the particular expression of someone memorizing something they expect to want later. She said, I don't know what I'm going back to. Claire said, you don't have to know yet. Patrice nodded. She got in the car. She drove away down the dirt road and into the trees, and Claire stood on the newly painted porch and watched until the car was gone. She added a second chair to the porch the following week. Not because she was expecting anyone, because the space was open now, and open space accommodates what comes rather than resisting it. The postcard from Marcus arrived in February in the small metal mailbox at the end of the dirt road that she had been clearing of pine needles every few days. It was a photograph of the Burnside Bridge in Portland, the light on it particular to early morning, before the traffic has decided what it intends to be. On the back, in the handwriting she knew Heat's working, hope yours is too, M. She put it on the kitchen windowsill next to the time which had survived January and was beginning to look permanent. Rebecca called in the middle of March on a Tuesday afternoon when Claire was home between shifts and the sun was doing something extraordinary with the ponderosa pines at the back of the property. The call was unexpected, not because Rebecca never called, but because there was a quality to her voice in the first few seconds that told Claire this was not a routine check-in. She said, can I come just for a night, maybe 2? Claire said yes. Rebecca drove from Salem the following Saturday. She came alone without Tom, without the children, with an overnight bag, and the particular stillness of a person who has been holding something at arm's length for a while and has run out of arm. The marriage had emerged that evening was in difficulty, not ended, not beyond repair, but under a stress that had been accumulating quietly for longer than Rebecca had admitted to anyone. She did not need to stay. She did not need advice. She needed her sister in the unspoken acknowledgement that needing a person was not the same as being unable to manage without them. They ate together and stayed up later than either of them was used to, and eventually the conversation arrived at the place it had been heading since Rebecca walked through the door. She apologized for the phone call, the one from months ago. She said, I should have fought for you. Tom was in the room and I let that be the reason. I'm sorry. Claire looked at her sister across the table. She had thought, when she imagined this conversation in the months since it happened, that she would feel the satisfaction of the apology as a settling of accounts, a balance restored. She did not feel that. What she felt was simpler and less transactional. She felt that the thing she had needed to say had not been said yet, and that Rebecca's apology, genuine as it was, had not said it for her. She said, you didn't turn me away, but you didn't fight for me either. There is a difference. The words fell into the space between them without violence. Rebecca did not defend herself. She sat with what had been said the way you sit with something true that you have been aware of for a while and have not been willing to name. The silence was not punishing. It was the silence of two people who have enough history between them to tolerate honesty. Eventually, Rebecca said, I know. They did not resolve it that night in the sense of putting it behind them. They did something better, which was to see it clearly and remain in the same room with it and with each other, and let that be enough for now. When Rebecca left on Monday morning, she stood by her car in the way Patrice had stood looking at the house. But what was in her face was different. It was recognition rather than longing. She said, I'll come back. Claire said, I know. She meant it. Daniel called on an April afternoon while Claire was planting tomatoes in the small raised bed she had built along the south side of the house. She had not expected to enjoy building it, but she had, and she had not expected the tomatoes to be interesting, but they were. She answered because she had decided somewhere in the course of the winter that she was not afraid of the conversation anymore. She was not waiting for it. She was not dreading it. It was simply something that would happen or would not, and she had ceased to organize her emotional life around its timing. Daniel said her name. Then he said, I knew about the house. I should have told you. She said yes. He said, I'm sorry, Claire. She sat with those words in the way she had learned to sit with things without rushing to fill the space around them. She thought about whether they gave her something she had needed. She found after a moment that the answer was not quite. The apology was real. She could hear that it was real. But she had already done the work that the apology was meant to enable, and the work did not require undoing and redoing simply because the catalyst had now arrived. She said, I know. Then she said, take care of yourself, Daniel. She heard him exhale a sound that contained more than she was going to try to name. Then the call ended. She set the phone face down in the garden soil beside her and went back to the tomatoes. She went to see Howard Gale one more time in May for the final piece of paperwork related to the trust transfer, a formality that his assistant could have handled by mail, but that Claire had chosen to handle in person because she had questions that paperwork could not answer. She asked about Daniel's inquiries, the ones Howard had referenced in December with a brevity that had stayed with her through the winter. Howard told her Daniel had contacted him approximately 2 years before the divorce, asking about the possibility of declining the inheritance on Claire's behalf, of removing her name from the trust before the transfer was complete. The legal basis for such a request, Howard explained, did not exist. A person cannot waive the rights of another person in a matter that has already been determined by a properly executed trust. He had told Daniel this. Daniel had not called again. Claire asked why he thought Daniel had made the request. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. He said he thought it was not about control in the conventional sense, not about keeping something for himself. He said, in my experience, when a man tries to remove a safety net from a woman's life, it is sometimes because he knows she has one and he is afraid of what she will do when she finds it. Claire looked at him. He said, that is not an excuse. It is simply what I observed. She sat with that on the drive back to the house 50 minutes through the high desert, the sky overhead carrying the particular clarity of a May afternoon in Central Oregon, blue enough to seem artificial, wide enough to seem boundless. She thought about Daniel not with anger and not with grief, but with something closer to the clear-eyed assessment you applied to a historical event that shaped the landscape you now inhabit. He had been afraid. He had made a series of decisions from that fear. And she had been the one who paid for it, which was unjust, and she had moved through the payment and arrived somewhere that was not punishment and was not consolation, but was genuinely in the way that counts hers. She understood that the story she had been telling herself about her marriage was a story about loss. And it was that, but it was also a story about a woman who had been standing in proximity to her own life for 11 years without fully inhabiting it, and who had needed everything to fall away before she discovered what she was actually capable of. She did not think Eleanor had planned for it to cost so much, but she thought Eleanor had understood that some things only reveal themselves under pressure, that you cannot know what you are made of until the conditions require the knowing. The box was in her chest. She understood that now. The heat in the house failed on a night in early December, 1 year after she had arrived. She knew it had failed because she woke at 2 in the morning with the particular cold of a room that has lost its warmth some time ago and has been quietly settling into a lower temperature while she slept. The thermometer on the wall read 41 degrees and was still dropping. She called the emergency repair service and was told without surprise on either end of the conversation that the roads were iced and the technician could not come before morning. She called Sandra not because Sandra could fix anything, but because she needed a voice she knew, and Sandra talked her through the circuit panel in a tone that was practical and unsentimental and exactly what the situation required. The circuit panel produced nothing useful. She stood in the kitchen and did the inventory of what was available to her. 3 wool blankets in the loft, her winter coat, 2 down sleeping bags she had bought at a thrift store in September for guests who had not yet arrived. The candles in the cabinet above the refrigerator, 6 of them, and a box of matches beside them. She built what warmth she could in the smallest room, the narrow back room where Sandra's cot was still folded against the wall, because she had never gotten around to moving it out, and she lit 4 of the candles and settled in with both sleeping bags and all 3 blankets and her coat in the peculiar calm of someone who has met worse and is no longer impressed by difficult. She did not sleep, but she was not afraid. This was the thing she noticed most in the hours between 2 and 6, while the temperature held steady at 38 degrees, and the candles did their work, and the trees outside stood dark and still in the iced air. She was not afraid. She was cold, and she was solving a problem, and she was paying attention to the specific sensations of the night, and she was going to be fine in the morning, and she knew all of this with a groundedness that had not always been available to her. In the parking lot 18 months ago, the fear had been everywhere, had occupied every available surface of her interior life. Not because the threat was larger than this one, but because she had not yet accumulated the evidence of her own competence. She had not yet learned what she learned every day now, which was that she could do the thing in front of her, and the thing after that, and the thing after that, and that this capacity did not require ideal conditions or the support of anyone in particular, only her own continued willingness to address what was actually happening rather than what she feared. The repair technician came at 8. The heat was restored by 9. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window with it while the house warmed around her, and she looked at the time on the windowsill which had survived the night without assistance. And she thought about that for a while. She found the journal entry that same weekend. She had been looking for a pen and had gone through the drawer in the bedroom where she kept the things that did not have a better home, and at the back of it was the journal she had kept during the last years of the marriage. She had not opened it since before the divorce. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it to a random page, not intending to stay, and found herself reading. The entry was from the 7th year of the marriage. The handwriting had the looser quality of something written quickly at the end of a day before sleep. Eleanor called today. We talked for a while about nothing much, and then she asked me out of nowhere what I would do if everything fell apart. I said I didn't know. She smiled. She changed the subject. Claire read it twice. She remembered the conversation. She remembered it now with the vividness of something that had been waiting in storage and needed only the right context to become legible. Eleanor at the kitchen table in Portland, drinking tea from the cup she always brought with her in her bag, because she did not trust other people's cups, asking the question in the way she asked an all-important questions casually, as if the answer did not matter much, as if she were simply making conversation. She had been making a record. She had been noting the fact of Claire's blankness, the absence of any plan, any exit, any self-knowledge sufficient to the question. And she had gone home and made a decision. Not immediately, perhaps, but within a year of that conversation, the living trust had been drawn up. The land had been secured. The house had been the project of the summers that followed. Eleanor had not given her a safety net. She had built her a starting line and hidden it in a place she could only find when she had stopped looking for safety and started looking for herself. Claire closed the journal and put it back in the drawer and went outside. It was late afternoon, and the light on the Ponderosa Pines was the particular gold of a high desert winter evening, long and lateral, turning everything it touched into something worth looking at twice. She sat in her chair on the painted porch. The second chair was beside her. Nobody was in it today. The key was in her hand. She had been carrying it in her coat pocket since December, in the way she had carried it in the Camry and in the back room at Copper Kettle and in the pocket of the jacket she had not worn for 3 weeks. It had been with her through everything, this small brass thing, lighter than it looked, worn at the edges from handling the teeth, softened by use across decades before she ever touched it. She turned it over in her palm. She had spent considerable time thinking about what the key meant, what it represented, whether it was a symbol of something she should be able to articulate. She had made a project of it the way Patrice had made a project of the house, trying to optimize, trying to extract meaning in a form she could use. But sitting on the porch in the long gold light of a December afternoon, she understood something she had not understood. When she was trying to, the key was not a symbol. It was a fact, a small material, ordinary fact. Eleanor had made a key and a door to match it, and had kept one in trust for her granddaughter. And everything that followed from that was simply what happened when you put a key in a door that was made for it. The meaning was not in the key. The meaning was in everything she had done with it. She had driven 3 hours on a cold Friday in December with nothing but an address and the fear in a man's voice that told her she was going in the right direction. She had stood in front of a door she did not know and put the key in the lock and pushed it open. She had stayed when staying was the harder choice. She had planted things that required patience. She had told the truth to people who needed to hear it. She had sat through a cold night without fear and watched the morning come. She had built a life here, not the one she had planned, not the one she had imagined in the early years of the marriage with the coffee maker and the shaped cushions and the unfinished books. Something else, something that fit her differently, less like a setting she had arranged around herself, and more like a language she had learned to speak. The sun dropped below the tree line. The cold came in behind it, the specific cold of a place that does not retain warmth long after the light is gone. She did not move. She had learned over the past year to stay a little longer than was comfortable, because the things you learn in that extra time are not the same as the things you learn while you are still comfortable. From inside the house, the light she had left on in the kitchen came through the window and lay a yellow rectangle on the porch boards. She looked at it. She thought about all the windows she had looked at from the outside, lit from within, belonging to lives she was not part of, lives that seemed untouched and continuous while she circled outside them in the dark. She had a window now. The light in it was hers. The key was worn and small and had outlasted the hands that had first made it and the hands that had kept it safe in the long, difficult passage from who she had been to who she was now. She closed her fingers around it gently, the way you hold something that has been many places and carried many meanings and has arrived finally at the last one. She was not the woman who had slept in the backseat of a car with a denim jacket for a pillow. She was not the woman who had stood in a kitchen waiting for the rest of a sentence that was never going to come. She was not even the woman who had first opened this door cautious and disbelieving and set her bag near the exit in case she needed to leave. She was the woman on the porch, the woman with the second chair and the painted wood and the time that had made it through January. The woman who had planted tomatoes and told the truth and sat through one long, cold, honest night and called it manageable. She was the woman who had chosen this piece by piece, day by day, without knowing in advance how it would turn out, which is the only way you ever really choose anything. Eleanor had known that, and she had waited and trusted and built something to receive her when she was finally ready. Inside the house, the light was warm and steady. Outside, the Ponderosa pines stood in the last of the dusk, tall and patient as everything that grows slowly and lasts. Claire sat on the porch with the key in her hand and watched the stars begin one by one to come out over Bend, Oregon, over the small house on the dirt road, over the life she had not planned and would not trade, And she stayed until the coal was complete and the sky was full, and she had looked at all of it she could hold. Then she went inside. The door closed softly behind her. The key went on the kitchen windowsill next to the postcard and the time and the small particular evidence of a life that was in every way that mattered entirely her own.